The salt spray of the Pacific hung thick and heavy over the asphalt sea of the grinder. It was a sacred space at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, a blacktop crucible where boys were broken and men were forged in sweat and sand. Every inch of it was saturated with the ghosts of effort, the echoes of barked commands, and the phantom sting of cold ocean water. For the trainees of BUD/S Class 234, it was the center of their universe, a place of profound suffering and singular purpose. And through this universe moved Frank Nelson. He moved with a quiet economy of motion that rendered him nearly invisible, a ghost of a different sort. An old man with a custodian's cart, his back stooped just enough to suggest a lifetime of labor, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and time. He swept the sand that the recruits dragged in from the surf, mopped the floors of the barracks, and emptied the trash cans filled with spent energy bar wrappers and discarded dreams. To the candidates, bristling with the kinetic energy of youth and ambition, he was just part of the landscape. A piece of base infrastructure, no more significant than a fire hydrant or a light post. Worse than invisible, he was an object of casual scorn. The source of their derision was a small, faded tattoo on his left forearm, usually hidden by the sleeve of his gray work shirt. On the rare occasions he rolled his sleeves up to scrub a stubborn patch of grime, the tattoo would appear. It was a simple, old-school frog skeleton, crudely rendered in faded blue-green ink that had bled and blurred over countless decades. It looked cheap. It looked amateurish. To the trainees, whose bodies were clean canvases or adorned with the sharp, intricate iconography of modern tattooing, it was a joke. The ringleader of the mockery was a candidate named Radcliffe. He was a specimen. 6'3", carved from granite, a former All-American lacrosse player from a prestigious university who had breezed through the physical requirements of the initial screening. Radcliffe saw the world as a hierarchy, and he had placed himself firmly at the top. He saw Frank Nelson at the absolute bottom. "Hey, check it out," Radcliffe would say in a stage whisper loud enough for half the platoon to hear. "Grandpa's showing off his ink again. Bet he got that in a Tijuana back alley for $5 and a bottle of tequila." Laughter would ripple through the exhausted ranks. It was a welcome distraction from the endless push-ups, the soul-crushing runs in the soft sand, and the bone-deep chill of the Pacific. Frank never reacted. He would hear the comments, his shoulders might tighten for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible flinch, and then he would continue his work. His silence was a mystery. It wasn't the cowed silence of a man intimidated. It was something else, something deeper and more unnerving. It was a patient, enduring silence, the kind a mountain has for the wind. This infuriated Radcliffe even more. He craved a reaction, a flicker of anger or shame that would validate his own superiority. He got nothing. So the harassment escalated from whispers to actions. A stray stream of water from a hose would drench Frank as he tried to sweep the grinder. A tray would be accidentally dropped in the chow hall, splattering Frank's clean floor with mashed potatoes and gravy. "Sorry, old-timer," Radcliffe would say, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "My hands are just so tired from all the pull-ups. You understand." Frank would just nod, retrieve his mop and bucket, and clean up the mess without a word. His resilience was a puzzle the recruits couldn't solve, and they resented him for it. He became a scapegoat, a repository for their own frustrations and fears. Mocking the old man was a way to feel strong when the instructors spent all day making them feel weak. He was their pressure valve. The whispers and rumors about him grew more elaborate. He was a failed recruit from the Vietnam era, a washout who never left, condemned to haunt the place of his failure. He was a cook who got a stupid tattoo to impress the real frogmen and was laughed out of the Navy. None of it was true, but the stories took on a life of their own, cementing Frank's status as a pariah. He was the ghost of failure, a cautionary tale, and the recruits, terrified of becoming ghosts themselves, kept their distance or joined in the jeering. Frank just kept working, his movements deliberate and precise, his eyes seeing everything and revealing nothing. He saw the swagger in Radcliffe's walk, the fear in a young recruit's eyes as he shivered after surf torture, the camaraderie of a boat crew helping a struggling teammate. He saw it all, a silent chronicler of the endless cycle of pain and pride that defined this place. One afternoon, Frank was polishing the brass bell that stood near the grinder. This was the bell a trainee had to ring 3 times if he wanted to quit. Its polished surface reflected the strained faces of the men doing push-ups on the asphalt. Radcliffe, leading his boat crew in a log PT evolution, saw his chance. "Hey Pops," he yelled, his voice strained from the weight of the massive wooden log on his shoulder. Thinking of ringing that bell? Finally giving up on that janitor career? His boat crew snickered, their laughter punctuated by grunts of exertion. Frank paused his polishing. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at Ratcliffe. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and for a moment, they held a focus so intense it was like a physical blow. He didn't say a word. He just looked. And in that look, Ratcliffe saw something that made his bravado falter. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hate. It was a calm, dispassionate assessment, the way a biologist might look at a specimen under a microscope. The moment passed. Frank turned back to the bell, his rag resuming its slow, circular motion. The incident was small, but it planted a seed of unease in the class. The old man hadn't flinched. He hadn't even blinked. Lieutenant Evans noticed. He was a young instructor, barely 30, but he had 2 combat deployments under his belt and a quiet watchfulness that set him apart from the other, more bombastic instructors. He believed in breaking men down to build them back up, but he detested bullying. He had been observing the class's treatment of the old custodian, and it bothered him. More than that, the custodian himself bothered him. Evans started watching Frank more closely. He saw things the recruits, blinded by their arrogance, missed. He saw the way Frank moved, with a fluid balance that belied his age, never a wasted step. He saw the way Frank's eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, a 360-degree awareness that was second nature to a combat veteran. He saw Frank, after the recruits had left the obstacle course, walk over to the cargo net. The old man placed a hand on the thick rope, his fingers instinctively testing its tension. He looked up at the top of the structure, his gaze analytical, as if calculating angles of fire or approach routes. One day, Evans saw Frank pick up a piece of rope a trainee had discarded. The knot was a sloppy, misshapen granny knot. Without looking down, his hands moving with the casual certainty of muscle memory, Frank untied it and retied it into a perfect figure-8 follow-through, the gold standard for load-bearing knots. He did it in less than 3 seconds. Evans, who had spent weeks mastering that knot, felt a jolt of astonishment. Who was this guy? His curiosity piqued, Evans went to the administrative office. "I need to see the personnel file for one of the civilian groundskeepers," he said to the clerk. "Name's Frank Nelson." The clerk, a bored petty officer, typed the name into the system. "Here he is. Frank Nelson. GS, 4 Custodial Services. Been here, wow. On and off for 30 years. Anything else in there?" Evans asked. "Service record." The clerk scrolled down. "Got a DD 214 here. Navy. Enlisted in 61. Honorably discharged in 68. That's it. Most of it is redacted. Like, blacked out redacted. Can't see his rate, unit, or field of service. Just dates and a discharge code. Redacted." That was a significant detail. Files weren't redacted for boiler tenders or cooks. They were redacted for men who had worked in the shadows, men whose service was a state secret. Evans felt a chill crawl up his spine. He started trying to talk to Frank. He'd find him on his rounds, leaning on a broom. "Morning, Frank," Evans would say, trying to sound casual. "Morning, Lieutenant," Frank would reply, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "See you watching the boys on the O course sometimes," Evans said one day. "Think they have what it takes?" Frank leaned on his broom, his pale eyes fixed on the recruits struggling over the high wall. "Some of them," he said after a long pause. "The ones who learn it's not about being strong. It's about not being weak." The simple profundity of the statement struck Evans. It was the core ethos of BUD/S, distilled to its essence. Evans decided to push a little. "That's an interesting tattoo you've got there, Frank," he said, nodding toward the faded frog on the old man's arm. "Where'd you get it?" Frank's expression didn't change, but a shudder seemed to come down behind his eyes. "A long time ago," he said, his tone polite but final. "In a place far from here." He then nodded at Evans, said, "Lieutenant," and shuffled off with his cart, leaving the instructor staring after him, more intrigued than ever. The tattoo. It was the key. Evans spent that night in the base library, digging through old yearbooks and unofficial histories of the Navy's special warfare units. He looked at grainy, black and white photos of men in UDT shorts and primitive scuba gear, their faces young and hard. He searched for images of early unit insignia, of homemade patches and tattoos. And then he found it. It was in a dusty, leather-bound book titled The Origins of Naval Special Warfare. There was a small, hand-drawn illustration in the appendix. The caption read, Early Unofficial Insignia, UDT 21, transitioning to SEAL Team 1, circa 1962. Nicknamed Freddy the Frog, worn only by the original 40 plank owners. Evans felt the air leave his lungs. Plank owners. The founding members. The men who had literally invented what it meant to be a Navy SEAL. They were legends, ghosts, men spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. Men like Roy Boehm and Rudy Bosch. And Frank Nelson. The old janitor who cleaned up their messes was one of the men who had built the very ground they stood on. Evans felt a wave of nausea and shame. He had stood by and watched as the flower of modern youth, arrogant and ignorant, had mocked a living monument. He didn't know what to do. Exposing Frank would violate the old man's obvious desire for anonymity. But letting the abuse continue felt like a desecration. He decided to wait, to watch, and to be ready to intervene if things went too far. He didn't have to wait long. The final week before Hell Week was a pressure cooker. The instructors turned up the heat, pushing the remaining candidates to their absolute physical and mental limits. Tempers were frayed, bodies were broken, and egos were raw. Ratcliffe, who had been struggling with the cold water tolerance evolutions, was feeling the pressure. His physical dominance was being chipped away by the relentless cold, and he felt his status as class leader slipping. He needed to reassert himself. He needed an easy target. He found one in the chow hall during evening meal. The trainees were shoveling food into their mouths, a silent, grim-faced assembly of exhaustion. Frank was mopping the floor near the exit, his movements as methodical and unhurried as ever. Ratcliffe finished his meal, stood up, and walked toward the tray return. He passed Frank, then paused. He turned, a smirk playing on his lips. The entire hall was watching. This was theater. You know, old man, Ratcliffe began, his voice loud and carrying across the silent room. I've been thinking about that tattoo of yours. Frank stopped mopping but didn't turn around. I think I figured it out, Ratcliffe continued, circling Frank like a shark. You were a cook, right? On a sub. Never saw the sun, never did anything brave. But you saw the real frogmen, the UDT guys, and you wanted to be like them. So you got the cheap little tattoo, hoping some of their glory would rub off on you. He was projecting his own insecurities, his own desperate desire for glory, onto the silent old man. Pathetic, really, Ratcliffe spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Living your whole life as a wannabe, and now you're here, cleaning up our scraps. It's the closest you'll ever get to being one of us. He shoved his tray into the return slot with a loud clatter, a punctuation mark on his tirade. Frank still didn't move. He stood with his back to Ratcliffe, his shoulders slumped slightly. For the first time, he looked like what the recruits thought he was, a frail, defeated old man. Ratcliffe smiled, basking in the perceived victory. He had finally broken him. He turned to the room, expecting applause or at least appreciative nods from his classmates. But the room was utterly silent. Not with approval, but with a thick, uncomfortable tension. Lieutenant Evans was on his feet at the instructor's table, his face a mask of cold fury. He was about to cross the room and end Ratcliffe's career right there. But before he could take a step, the main doors of the chow hall swung open. Standing in the doorway was Captain Thorne. Captain Thorne was the commander of the Naval Special Warfare Center. He was a man who radiated authority from every pore. Tall, lean, with a face that looked like it was carved from weathered oak, he wore a chest full of medals that told the story of a life lived at the sharp end of the spear. When he walked into a room, even the most battle-hardened instructors snapped to attention. The entire chow hall, trainees and instructors alike, scrambled to their feet. As you were, Thorne said, his voice a low baritone that commanded instant obedience. He started to walk toward the instructor's table, but then he stopped. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room, taking in the scene. He saw the frozen tableau, Ratcliffe, puffed up with arrogant pride, the silent, shamed faces of the trainees, Lieutenant Evans, coiled like a spring, and the old man with the mop, his back still to the room. Thorne's gaze settled on the old man. He frowned, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, and then his expression changed to one of profound, utter shock. He changed course. He walked straight past the instructor's table, past the rows of stunned trainees. He walked directly toward the custodian. Ratcliffe, thinking the captain was coming to commend him for his motivational speech, puffed out his chest even further. "Just clearing out the civilian clutter, Captain," he said with a smug grin. Thorne ignored him completely. He walked as if Ratcliffe didn't exist. He stopped 2 feet behind Frank Nelson. The room held its collective breath. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Captain Thorne, the decorated commander of the most elite training facility in the world, snapped his heels together. He brought his right hand up in the sharpest, most respectful salute a man could render. His posture was ramrod straight, his gaze locked on the back of the old janitor's head. "Mr. Nelson," Captain Thorne said, his voice ringing with a reverence that stunned the entire room into pin-drop silence. "It is an honor, sir." Frank Nelson finally moved. He turned around slowly, the mop handle clattering to the floor. He looked at the captain, and a small, weary smile touched his lips. "At ease, Captain," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "No need for all that." Thorne held the salute for a second longer, then crisply dropped his hand. "The hell there isn't, Froggy," he said, his voice now filled with warmth and a touch of awe. "I thought you were living in the mountains in Montana." "Got tired of the quiet," Frank said with a shrug. "Figured I'd come back here. See if the new breed had any grit." Thorne's eyes hardened as he glanced at Ratcliffe, then back at the class. He turned and faced the trainees, his expression shifting from reverence to pure, unadulterated fury. "You," he said, his voice dangerously low as he pointed a finger at Ratcliffe. "What is your name?" "Candidate Ratcliffe, sir," the trainee stammered, his face having gone pale with confusion and dawning horror. "Candidate Ratcliffe," Thorne repeated, savoring the name like a bad taste. "You stand there in the presence of a living legend, a man who forged the very trident you hope to one day wear, and you dare to speak to him with such disrespect." He took a step closer, his voice rising with controlled rage. "You see this man? You see this janitor? This old-timer?" Thorne reached out and gently took Frank's left arm, pushing up the sleeve to reveal the faded frog tattoo. He held it up for the entire class to see. "This tattoo," Thorne roared, his voice bouncing off the cinder block walls. "You think this is a joke? This is Freddy the Frog. It's the mark of a plank owner of United States Navy SEAL Team 1. It is worn by the handful of men who were there at the very beginning. The men who wrote the book." He let go of Frank's arm and jabbed a finger toward the trainees' barracks. "That manual you all study every night? The one on unconventional warfare, demolitions, and hydrographic reconnaissance? The one you treat like a Bible?" He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "He wrote it." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sound of dawning comprehension, of profound and sickening shame. Ratcliffe looked as if he had been punched in the gut. His face was ashen, his mouth hanging open. The world had just been turned upside down. The men he had tormented, the men he had called a pathetic wannabe, was a founding father of the SEALs. He wasn't just a SEAL, he was one of the SEALs. Thorne wasn't finished. He turned his wrath fully on Ratcliffe. "You come here, with your college degree and your athletic trophies, and you think you know what it means to be a warrior. You think it's about muscle and ego. You have no idea." He gestured toward Frank. "This man, Frank Nelson, swam through miles of frozen water in the Mekong Delta before you were a bad idea. He conducted operations that are still classified, missions that saved American lives and shaped history. He did it not for glory, not for a fancy tattoo, but because his country asked him to." Thorne's voice dropped to a seething whisper. "And he did it with humility. With quiet professionalism. The two qualities you so clearly lack. You are not worthy to stand on the same ground as him, let alone wear the same uniform." The condemnation was absolute. It was a public execution of a man's character. "Candidate Ratcliffe," Thorne said, his voice now flat and cold as ice. "Your time here is over. You have demonstrated that you do not possess the character, the judgment, or the humility required to be a Navy SEAL. Pack your bags. Report to the Master-at-Arms. You are dropped from the course, effective immediately. Ratcliffe's face crumpled. His dream, the sole focus of his entire life for the past 2 years, had just evaporated in a cloud of his own arrogance. Sir, he started to plead. Do not call me sir, Thorne snapped. Get out of my sight. Defeated, humiliated, Ratcliffe turned and shuffled out of the chow hall, not daring to meet the eyes of his former classmates. The silence he left behind was heavy with the weight of the lesson that had just been delivered. Thorne then scanned the faces of the remaining trainees, his eyes lingering on each one. Let this be a lesson to all of you, he said, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its intensity. The legacy of this community was not built by peacocks. It was built by quiet men. Men like Frank Nelson. Men who valued teamwork over ego, mission over self. Before you can ever hope to earn the trident, you must first learn to respect the men who gave it meaning. He turned back to Frank, his expression once again filled with deep respect. Frank, I apologize on behalf of my command. This never should have happened. Frank Nelson just shook his head, a look of weary patience on his face. They're just kids, Captain, he said softly. Full of fire and vinegar. They'll learn. The ones who are meant to be here, anyway. Still, Thorne said. Let me buy you dinner. The real stuff. At the officers' club. I'd like that, Frank said. Thorne put a hand on Frank's shoulder and guided him toward the door, 2 generations of elite warriors, a living bridge between the past and the present. As they left, the trainees of Class 234 remained frozen in place. The chow hall, once a place of respite, now felt like a courtroom where they had all been judged and found wanting. They looked at the spilled mop bucket on the floor, the symbol of their collective shame. The man they had mocked was a hero. The values they thought they understood had been a shallow imitation. They had been humbled in a way no amount of physical hardship could ever accomplish. Their perspective had been irrevocably altered. The instructors, who had been just as ignorant as the trainees, stood in stunned silence, re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about the quiet old men who worked among them. Lieutenant Evans finally moved. He walked over and picked up the fallen mop. He dipped it in the bucket and began to clean the floor, the simple, humble task now feeling like an act of penance. The rest of the class watched him, and a slow ripple of understanding passed through them. One by one, other trainees came forward. They grabbed rags from the custodian's cart. They got on their hands and knees. In complete silence, the remaining members of Class 234 cleaned the chow hall floor until it shone. It was their first act as a unified team, bonded not by shared suffering, but by shared shame and a newfound, profound respect. The next morning, the mood on the grinder was different. The usual arrogant chatter was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. The instructors barked their commands, but the trainees responded with a new kind of determination. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were trying to be worthy. Frank Nelson was not there. His custodian cart was gone. His absence was more powerful than his presence had ever been. The space he had occupied now felt sacred, a reminder of the quiet giant who had walked among them unnoticed. Later that day, Captain Thorne addressed the class again. Mr. Nelson has decided to finally retire for good, he announced. He said his work here was done. He asked me to tell you that he wishes you luck. He also said, and I quote, "Tell them to stay humble, or the sea will humble them." The words settled over the class, a final piece of wisdom from the ghost who had taught them their most important lesson. Class 234 went on to have one of the lowest attrition rates in BUD/S history. The men who graduated were different. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence that replaced their former swagger. They became known as a class that valued humility in history, a class that understood the debt they owed to the men who came before. Years later, a young ensign, fresh from the academy and new to SEAL Team 3, saw an old photo on the wall of the team room. It was a grainy, black and white shot of a handful of hard-looking men in Vietnam, their faces smeared with camo paint. In the center of the group was a young man with startlingly pale eyes, a ghost of a smile on his lips. On his arm, clear even in the faded photograph, was a crude tattoo of a frog skeleton. "Who's that?" the ensign asked a grizzled Master Chief who was cleaning his rifle nearby. The Master Chief looked up at the photo, his eyes softening. "That's Frank Nelson," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "They called him the Ghost. He was one of the originals." The Master Chief paused, then looked at the ensign, his gaze sharp. "There's a story about him. From back when he was an old man working as a janitor at BUD/S, ever hear it?" "No, Master Chief," the ensign replied. "Well, pull up a chair," the Master Chief said, a small smile touching his lips. "It's a lesson every frogman needs to learn." And so the legend of Frank Nelson lived on, a whispered story in the barracks and team rooms, a reminder that heroes are not always the ones who make the most noise. Sometimes, they are the quiet ones, the ones who carry the weight of history on their shoulders and the wisdom of experience in their silent gaze. Sometimes, they are the ones with the faded tattoos, the unassuming giants who walk among us, waiting for us to be wise enough to see them. The story became a part of the SEAL ethos, a cautionary tale against the sin of arrogance, a lesson passed down from one generation of warriors to the next. Respect your roots. Honor your elders. And never, ever judge a man by a faded tattoo. Because you never know when you might be standing in the presence of greatness, disguised as a humble man with a mop and bucket. The grinder at Coronado remained a place of forging, but after Frank Nelson, it was also a place of remembrance, where the black asphalt held not just the sweat of the present, but the indelible, honorable shadow of the past. The bells still stood there, polished and gleaming, a temptation to quit. But now, the men of BUD/S saw it differently. They saw it not just as an escape, but as a silent tribute to the men who had polished it for years, a men who had never quit, who had endured, and who had defined the very standard they were now killing themselves to meet. And in that silent understanding, they found a new source of strength.